Winter, 1943, the Urals. Steam hangs in the air like a ghost as day shift workers spill from the brick stacks of factory number 183 in Nizhny Tagil. Sparks arc, rivets fly, and diesel cough echoes through half-frozen bays. It is here, far from the front, yet bound to it by rails and orders, that a guarded experiment moves from drawing boards to steel. Soviet engineers call it an intermediate tank. Officially, it is the T-43. Unofficially, it is something more daring, an attempt to replace the T-34 in the middle of a total war. The story of the T-43 is not simply the tale of a prototype that failed. It is the story of a crossroads, of choices shaped by time, production, and survival, of how one unfinished machine quietly redirected the fate of Soviet armor. Tonight, we open the file. 2 years earlier, in 1941, the T-34 shocked the world. Its sloped armor, broad tracks, and 76.2mm gun was a punch the Wehrmacht did not expect. But the Eastern Front was an evolving battlefield. By late 1942, German heavy and improved medium tanks, Tigers and then Panthers, appeared. Their guns reached farther. Their armor resisted hits. The T-34's 76mm could not reliably penetrate at safe distances. What had been an advantage became a contest of adaptation. Inside the People's Commissariat for the Tank Industry and the Red Army's Armored Directorate, GAB2, debate intensified. Upgun the T-34, create a new tank, or try both. Aleksandr Morozov, the chief designer whose team had been evacuated from Kharkiv to the Urals, pushed for a deeper redesign. The T-34's raw strengths were proven, but its compromises were too. The two-man turret overloaded the commander with gun layer duties. The Christie suspension limited interior space and modernization potential. Internal ergonomics, ammunition stowage, access, and vision were all under wartime pressure. Thus, the T-43 was conceived not as a clean-sheet dream, but as a rational step, a next T-34 that could be built by the same factories with minimized disruption, if the plan worked. What did this intermediate tank aim to change? First, armor. The T-34's 45mm sloped frontal plate had been a revolutionary choice in 1940. By 1943, engineers wanted more. Sources differ on exact figures from prototype to prototype, but the T-43's frontal hull armor was substantially thickened, roughly in the range of 70 to 75mm, while preserving slope. The new turret followed suit, with a heavier casting and, crucially, a commander's cupola to improve battlefield awareness. The goal was survival under the longer-barreled German 75mm and 88mm guns, never guaranteed, but significantly improved. Second, the crew's fighting environment. A three-man turret, long discussed and tested on various T-34 improvements, was now central. By freeing the commander from the gun's controls, the T-43 promised better leadership, faster target acquisition, and more consistent fire under stress. Vision devices and periscopes were upgraded, as much an ergonomic reform as a tactical one. Third, the undercarriage. The T-43 adopted a torsion-bar suspension. It was a forward leap from the T-34's Christie system, offering a lower profile, smoother ride, improved accuracy on the move, and better space utilization inside the hull. It was also a deliberate bridge toward future concepts already gestating on Morozov's boards. And fourth, the gun. The earliest T-43 work retained the 76.2 mm F-34 gun, the weapon of the standard T-34. But the battlefield was moving. Engineers tested whether the new turret could host an 85 mm weapon, an answer to the Tiger problem and to Panther fronts appearing in reports from Kursk and beyond. The fit was tight, the recoil forces heavy, and mounting an 85 mm demanded careful rebalancing of turret ring dimensions, ammunition stowage, and loader's work cycle. But across 1943, the 85 mm ambition hardened from idea to requirement. There were two competing clocks, one mechanical, one strategic. The mechanical clock asked, can we make the T-43 robust and reliable quickly? Can we not only build it, but build it by the thousands right now? The strategic clock answered, every week of retooling costs tanks at the front. Every tank not delivered is a gap in the line. Trials came. Engineers rolled the T-43 onto proving grounds. One constant in Soviet testing was the NIBT range at Kubinka near Moscow, where vehicles were run to failure and measured against rigid standards. The T-43's improved protection and revised fighting compartment were real advantages. Drivers and gunners, used to the T-34's idiosyncrasies, reported a different feel, steadier over rough ground, more predictable when firing, a turret that finally freed the commander to command. Yet, nothing is free in metallurgy. Extra armor and a heavier turret pushed the weight upward. With the same V2 diesel at around 500 horsepower, raw mobility metrics, the sprint, the climb, the acceleration, sat close to the T-34's, but with less margin. Fuel consumption ticked up. Track, gearbox, and bearings were asked to do more. On paper, this could be solved by refinements and new subassemblies. In practice, the refinements meant rejigging jigs, new turret rings, new suspension arms, new welding templates, new supplier lists, new spare parts, new training for thousands. The T-34's miracle was not a single tank. It was a production ecosystem stretched across the Urals and beyond, from Uralvagonzavod in Nizhny Tagil to the Chelyabinsk Tankrograd complex, and further east to Omsk. In 1941-42, entire factories had been evacuated under fire, bolted to fresh floors, and spun up to mass-produce tanks. Now, in 1943, the question shifted: risk that fragile equilibrium for a better machine, or wring more performance from the machine that already flowed from the rails? In July 1943, the Battle of Kirks raged. Panthers arrived in battalion strength. Tigers prowled. Red Army anti-tank gunners and tankers learned, again, the lesson of range. At certain angles and distances, the T-34's 76 mm struggled to kill quickly. Commanders demanded the 85 mm. It was a clear requirement, but the decision was not yet which hull should carry it. Here, the T-43 met its paradox. It had been designed to modernize the T-34 in a package light enough for the same factories to absorb. Yet, the fastest route to the front might be simpler still. Redesign the T-34's turret to carry the 85 mm gun, accepting compromises in hull space and future growth in exchange for speed. In late 1943, a high-level decision landed like a hammer blow on the drawing tables. Priority would be to upgun the T-34 into the T-34-85 and preserve mass production at all costs. The wording captured the mood. The front could not afford a pause. The T-43's virtues were acknowledged. Its time was not. Was the T-43 canceled because it failed? Not exactly. It was canceled because it succeeded too slowly for a war that did not forgive slow success. What, then, did the experiment leave behind? Start with the most visible inheritance, the three-man turret and the 85mm gun. The T-34-85's large, cast turret, with a commander's cupola and improved optics, owes much to the intellectual momentum of the T-43 program. Engineers who had wrestled with loader workflow, recoil mechanisms, and turret balance on the T-43 now applied their lessons to the older hull. The result entered production at the turn of 1944. It gave Red Army tank platoons a commander who could actually command, and a gun that could fight, on better terms, against German mid- to late-war armor. Underneath, in places the camera cannot see, the T-43 did something subtler. It pointed the way beyond the T-34 entirely. The torsion-bar logic, the lower hull profiles, the rebalanced internal volumes, these migrated forward into the T-44, a post-Kursk design that kept the T-34's soul but changed its bones. The T-44 would, in turn, lead to the T-54, T-55 family, one of the most produced tank lines in history. In that lineage, the T-43 stands as a developmental hinge, an unfinished machine whose engineering DNA reached far beyond its short life. If we open the test reports, we find both hard numbers and cautious prose. Frontal armor thicknesses and plate angles are recorded. Mobility over kilometers of mud and corduroy track is described. At Kubinka, evaluators favored the T-43's protection and fighting compartment, but noted the impact of added mass on reliability margins. There were attempts, and here accounts vary, at mounting 85mm variants, notably the D5T early on and later guns like the S-53 once production stabilized. Some engineers believed the T-43 was the better long game. Others looked at delivery timetables and shook their heads. You can draw a line between those two camps and see the entire Soviet wartime industrial strategy balanced upon it. The human stories make the technical debate real. Picture a welder named Lydia, sleeves scorched, guiding molten seams along a turret cheek that no production line has ever seen before. Picture a test driver, Stepan, who has driven T-34s hard enough to know exactly when a track link is about to bite. He pushes the T-43 over a frozen berm, listens to the engine tumble, and feels, not hears, the difference in how the hull settles. Picture Morozov, eyes rimmed with the gray of too many afternoons ending at midnight, reading an order to pivot resources to the T-34-85. Maybe he exhales and thinks, "We didn't fail. We taught ourselves what comes next." It is tempting, then and now, to make this a morality play. Brave engineers versus cautious bureaucrats. Better tank versus good enough. Reality is less dramatic and more demanding. The Red Army in 1943 was not a laboratory. It was a front stretching from the Baltic to the Sea of Azov. It needed thousands of tanks that could be delivered and maintained, supplied and repaired. Spare parts, training manuals, toolkits, and field experience mattered as much as blueprints. The T-34-85 could exploit existing realities. The T-43 required bending them. And yet, the T-43 was not simply set aside and forgotten. Its story continued in workshops. In the quiet way, ideas survive. When the T-44 entered the frame in late 1944, with torsion bars, a new hull, and a continued 85mm armament, it did so along a path the T-43 helped clear. When the T-54 began its long life after the war, it stood on those same foundations. The T-43 was not a dead end. It was a scaffold. There are contested details in the archival record. Some documents suggest 2 principal T-43 prototypes were completed and trialed in 1943. Others hint at an additional test hull. Exact frontal and turret armor values shift by a few millimeters from report to report, reflecting iterative changes during trials. There are differing accounts of which 85mm guns were mounted, when, and for how many test cycles. Such discrepancies are normal for wartime development, when the line between prototype, pre-series, and modified hull can blur in memoranda that raced to keep up with the metal. But on the core points, the record is consistent. The T-43 was a medium-class, sloped armor tank engineered by the Morozov Bureau as a successor to the T-34. It featured heavier armor, a 3-man turret with improved command facilities, and torsion-bar suspension. It was tested in 1943. It did not enter production, not because it was fundamentally flawed, but because the State Defense Committee prioritized uninterrupted T-34 manufacture, transitioning that manufacturing base rapidly to the T-34-85 turret and gun. The decision saved time, and time, in 1943, was measured in villages not lost, bridges not broken, and railheads not overrun. If you walk through the surviving photographs, factory floors with raw plates stacked like books, lineups of tanks with chalk marks on their noses, you can sense the pressure of that choice. In one image, a turret sits apart on a stand, a cupola catching the light. In another, an engineer leans into a hull opening, tape measure pulled to an exact number he will later argue about in a report's margin. Production was not just volume, it was argument. The debate made welded seams better. The T-43 also shines a light on the Soviet approach to battlefield learning. Reports from Kursk and Smolensk drove demands for thicker armor and a heavier gun. Reports from field workshops warned against disrupting part chains that kept tanks rolling. Designers tried to reconcile both, build a better vehicle that could be made by the same hands. When that knot could not be tied quickly enough, they cut it by redesigning only what was necessary on the T-34 to carry an 85mm gun and a commander's new responsibilities. The T-43, even denied its own production line, had made the argument for those responsibilities impossible to ignore. There is one more way to read the T-43's file. As a sign of confidence. Only an army that believed it could win would invest scarce time and steel in a tank meant not just for today's battle, but for tomorrow's. The USSR in 1943 was no longer the stunned nation of 1941. It was an industrial organism that had evacuated, rebuilt, and learned to surge. The T-43 was a question that only such an organism could ask. What comes after the T-34 without collapsing the miracle that made the T-34 possible? On paper, the T-43's production cancellation seems like a dead end. On the battlefield maps that followed, it looks more like a fork taken at speed. The T-34-85 appeared in brigades in early 1944 and fought across the final offensive year into Berlin. The T-44 entered limited service before the war's end and quietly set the stage for the post-war Corps. In that sense, the T-43's legacy is not a single tank at all. It is a sequence. The end of the war did not turn engineers into poets. They left their poetry in steel. If you climb onto a post-war T-54 and look down the glacis, you are looking across the argument the T-43 started. If you stand inside a T-34-85 turret and rest your hand on the commander's cupola, you can feel the decision that ended the T-43 and saved, at least for that year, the production line. Both are true. Both stem from the same set of winter-lit rooms in 1943, where men and women in heavy coats pushed pencils and welders with equal conviction. One of those men, we can imagine, closes a folder at the end of a long day. He has read the order, "Preserve T-34 production," and he has already assigned his team to the new 85mm turret geometry. He writes a final note on the T-43 file. Useful. The word is bare. It does not capture the sleepless nights, or the hurried teacups, or the calls from the proving ground, counting kilometers to failure. But it captures the truth. The T-43 was useful. Not for what it did in battle. It never fought. But it forced a decision, clarified priorities, and embodied the bridge from one generation of Soviet tanks to the next. It made the T-34-85 sharper, sooner. It made the T-44 and then the T-54 possible. It condensed a year of fear and ambition into a machine that taught its makers more than it could give. Our documentary ends where it began, on the factory floor. Under a crane hook, a turret casting rotates and lowers onto a ring. The workers below guide it by palm and habit. Somewhere in that moment, between metal and method, is the reason the T-43 mattered. War demanded a perfect tank. Reality offered a good tank now and a better tank later. The T-43 made choosing both possible. In the quiet after the clamor, as the shift whistle fades, the unfinished tank stands in shadow. It will not go to the front, but its ideas will. And in a war where ideas travel by rail, that is sometimes the most decisive victory of all.